Hey all, welcome to the API and Anchor, a special place where we can gather together for a good old chat about the latest happenings in the world of APIs and perhaps enjoy ourselves a fine cask-based beverage. I'm joined by Josh, the co-founder of Zuplo, and we're going to talk about a few things that have taken place in the world of APIs over the past week. Josh, how you doing?
Awesome, Martin. Cheers, mate. Here's to being in the API and Anchor.
Thanks very much. I'm glad that my cask-based beverage comes in a plastic bottle and is pink, but let's...
We got to get you like a tankard.
We do need to have a tankard.
Really old school Union Bar kind of vibe to it, right?
Yeah, I mean, if that makes it legit for me to actually drink whilst we do this, then I should let you know that I'm okay with that.
I am neither approving nor denying this request to drink at work.
Excellent. Well, we'll move on quickly from that, just in case that it does become an HR violation, and start talking about some of the things that have taken place in the world of APIs. I've gathered together a few bits that I thought it would be interesting for us to talk about, and the first one is the API Management or APIM Magic Quadrant that Gartner put out in the past couple of weeks. It tells a story that is very different from previous years as far as API management goes, which is obviously, probably very interesting to the CEO and co-founder of a company in that space. What do you have to say about what they've got written on their little graph there?
Yeah, I mean, we should bring up the graphic of a great analysis by a guy called Kamal that has his own API startup called APIULA. Has some good experience in the API space. He worked at Tyke and one of the others, I think. And he did this nice graph that charted how they'd moved, which I think is interesting. So that should be on screen now for folks, hopefully. And we have to disclose that we have a vested interest in this. Like Zuplo is an API management product. We're not quite big enough to be in the Magic Quadrant yet, but we did get our first honorable mention from Gartner this time. So yeah, go Zuplo. We've already had a lead or two from it, so that's great. Thanks, Gartner. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of questions about it. I mean, let's just talk about the obvious things. There's some winners and some losers. The biggest winner is probably our friends at Gravity, who's moved into the leader quadrant. That's from a gateway perspective. Also, our friends at SmartBear have moved into the leader quadrant, but they notably do not have a gateway. They are API management tooling. I think that's one of the things that's a bit messed up about this quadrant. Like, what is it? Postman and Gravity are not competitors. So no. I wonder if there's many quadrants where you have entries that are they're in the same space, but they're not competitors.
Yeah, that one threw me a little bit because it's interesting to see people like SmartBear and Postman listed in the same space as what is effectively like Google and Kong, and it's like, because it feels like they really are quite different in terms of their overall propositions. And it's like, are they transitioning in terms of what their products are offering towards like an API management play? Because I don't necessarily whether I've really seen that from both of them.
Yeah, no, we don't know obviously the plans of those. I mean, I've heard rumors that the Postman folks are very anti-gateway, whatever that means. So I guess we'll wait and see. But I actually think it's probably one of the things holding those folks back. Actually, and I think Ken Lane, who's a former Postman head of evangelism there, I think he was chief evangelical officer or something, actually mentioned this on LinkedIn as well. So anyway, well done to Gravity. Congrats. I mean, I think, my opinions here come from the viewpoint of being a competitor to these guys. I think it's a bit of a beast of a product to use and deploy and set up, but they have done some good work on being like an event gateway and starting to build up sort of a management surface for others, which I suspect is the reason why they've done well. The other winner, which I just don't understand, is Google and Apigee, and then moving further up and to the right. I'm like, what did you guys do? Like, what? Well, I mean, has Apigee done anything recently? I have not seen any innovation, any improvement there. Like, maybe they got some better customers that got to know about, or I just don't know. That is baffling to me, especially when we see the likes of Tyke moving out of the leader quadrant, who have done some stuff recently. So yeah, confusing to me to see Apigee going further up and to the right, having done nothing, whilst everyone else is like innovating quickly and doing new and interesting things.
Yeah, I was wondering about that one, and something that came to mind that could be a possibility here is obviously, look, as far as we know, the product hasn't really changed very much, and customer base, potentially, has changed. We're not to know, but there is definitely I know from previous companies that I've worked at, there were probably quite a lot of deals that were just going to renew simply because people were already so bought into being a part of that world and haven't found something else that they're going to use to either replace it or build their own, or moved over to like a hybrid version of it, and it's just renewing at quite significant amounts of money. And simply because of that, potentially it could have continued to push them up, just based on that legacy hold that they have at this point, is proving obviously here, right? It's going to be quite difficult to knock them out of that quadrant at any point.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's certainly my favorite competitor to go up against, though. I love nothing more than replacing an Apigee. And if you look at the direction they moved in, they moved up primarily in the ability to execute, which, is obviously it's Google. They have the market presence, and, no one thinks Google's going to go out of business anytime soon. What does surprise me about that, though, is, I know lots of Apigee customers that are pretty frustrated with Apigee because they keep changing the version of the thing from Apigee Edge or whatever it was called to Apigee X, and encouraging customers to move on, and creating a lot of pain, because moving from Apigee Edge to Hybrid or X or whatever the product is called is not a trivial thing to do. We should probably talk about some of the losers, though. There are some whopping shifts left and down. So I guess the biggest loser is Software AG, who we don't run into very often. So it sort of doesn't surprise me. I guess it surprised me they were a leader for so long, who have moved from leaders back into niche players, right, back into the bottom left quadrant, which was a big drift. Amazon Web Services, very stagnant product there with their gateway, shifts massively left. Goes up on their ability to execute. Again, it's freaking Amazon. Like, who's going to argue with their ability to market and support and sustain the product? But they haven't done anything with that. We don't really think of it as a competitor anymore because it's so commodity level of capability. So I think that's fair that they've slipped back in the completeness of their vision.
Yeah, I have no shame in admitting this, that when I looked at this, I actually was seeing Software AG and I didn't know who Software AG were. So, sorry, Software AG, but
yeah. I think it's like a German consultancy, right? They also have a bunch of like products they sell. I'm actually not 100% sure what it is either. We don't bump into them a lot.
My apologies to anyone at Software AG that I'm connected to on LinkedIn.
Yeah. And Boomi moving to the right a little bit now. They've made a few acquisitions. Although those acquisitions are wacky to me. I do not understand them. Like the acquisition of Mashree's IP. I don't know what to make of that. Be interesting to see how they go. Obviously, Boomi is has pretty big backing, so has good ability to execute as well. But the other quick notable loser on completeness of vision again is Axway sliding left, which is a very big old fashioned player. But yeah, no, I think the most notable things here are congrats to Gravity, well done on there. Congrats to Google, whatever you did, and sorry to our friends at Tyke.
Yeah,
sucks for them.
And congratulations to us on the honourable mention. Hey, honourable mention, perfect. Next year, quadrant placement.
Well, we'll see. We gotta hit some. Unfortunately, they have these like weird milestones you have to hit. It'd be great for us to hit that. We'll see. We'll certainly try.
Maybe we invite them to our virtual pub and see if that works out.
We'll get Mark O'Neill, one of the lead analysts on this. I'm sure he'd love a beer with us here at the API and Anchor.
Absolutely, that would be.
You can explain some of these decisions.
There you go. You'd be a great guest down here.
There's your invite, Mark.
All right. So moving on. Speaking of big moves, Speakeasy just announced that they've raised $15 million as their Series A, which is massive. That's a relatively decent sized Series A to talk about these days. And as far as the SDK generation space goes, it is busy. There's some interesting people in that mix, but a real, I think, quite positive move that they're managing to land so much. It speaks quite a lot about how much there is an investment going on in companies that can provide that extra developer experience quickly for companies that are looking to really nail their developer go-to-market, which many of them are.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big raise, right? 15 million Series A, especially since it's not fundamentally an AI company today. I mean, I'm sure they've got some AI angles now, as most people raising money do. Mm-hmm. That's a big raise, so congratulations to Sagar and folks. We kind of know them. We're somewhat friendly. We don't compete with them, right? With complementary products. In fact, you're doing an interview with these guys, with like a bunch of SDK folks, right? Soon.
Yeah. We actually will have a conversation with Speakeasy, a whole run through about everything that they do and their thoughts on SDK generation and how their platform works, coming up in a couple of weeks' time.
Awesome. So that'll be here on this channel. So subscribe, folks. Subscribe for notifications, all that good stuff. So there's a few players here. There's the interesting ones I think are Speakeasy, API Magic have been around a while, doing some cool stuff. The other one that seems to be getting a lot of Guillermo-like buzz is Stainless, which is some ex-Stripe folks who have some other great customer names like OpenAI and so on. I'm not, they haven't announced any fundraising, but that seems like a pretty cool product and pretty cool team. I'll be honest, I'm a little surprised that this is such an exciting space, because once I saw the LLMs start to get really good at code generation, I immediately was skeptical of SDK generation as like a viable product long term. Like, won't you just go to ChatGPT and say, hey, can you generate me a client for this thing? Well, it seems like I'm wrong, at least certainly based on how investors are thinking about it. So it's one to watch. It's really interesting, and congrats to the folks at Speakeasy. I assume it's a good product. Vercel are going to be pretty fussy in who they use, and having Vercel as a customer is a really good land for them.
Yeah, Vercel, I think Mistral AI use them, and Verizon as well, which is interesting because I come from like an API and like telephony background, especially when I was working at Vonage previously, where SDKs were a huge part of our developer go-to-market. We had an SDK for just about every language under the sun. Very much did all of our kind of developer marketing, developer outbound stuff around the languages that these SDKs were based on. And it's interesting to see Verizon like jumping on this as well, because telcos traditionally they are not fans of great developer experience, and I can say that with confidence. So one of the areas where I think that they were kind of lacking is not having more robust ways for people to work with their APIs, but not necessarily the trust, I guess, to make the investment for themselves in people to work on this stuff. So I definitely do see where companies like Speakeasy and Stainless and API Magic, fall in terms of being able to say, okay, we've identified a gap that will work here for you, and we can jump in and certainly bring this to the fore for you in a way that isn't going to cost you a huge amount of money, I guess. Yep. And is going to be easy for you to jump in and say, okay, we need the .NET audience, we're going to need a .NET SDK, let's get that out the door, and it's done. You don't have to hire anybody, you don't have to go through the process of building it out, in a really significant way. And, their proposition is that if you're working off of Open API, that, it's always going to be up to date as well, which is, it's solid. I can see why it works for companies like that for sure. It's interesting though, because, in the press release they put out, they said they've got, 7,250 SDKs have been generated so far, but they didn't mention anything about what the breakdown of languages was in there. And that's what...
you think that'd be interesting sort of analysis for a report?
That would be interesting to me, because I feel like a lot of the time you've got, people who are always going to be like very, very vehemently wanting to build a certain kind of SDK for the company that they work for. And they're probably, going to say, okay, well, look, the Node.js SDK, we're going to keep that one in-house, right? The Python SDK, we're probably going to keep that one in-house, right? But then there's others, that maybe, don't necessarily justify having a hire for, probably isn't tied to the core stack that, an application that's looking to use this is built in. So maybe, Rust or .NET, areas where there are large, PHP potentially as well, areas where there are large audiences, but people aren't necessarily going to be fighting to build the SDK, inside of the organization. But I'd love to see the breakdown of that, just to know.
I don't know what that number means, though. Sorry to the Speakeasy folks, but it sounds like one of those just classic vanity metrics of SDKs generated ever. I mean, what does that even mean? People coming in, it's like how many people have ever signed into Zuplo? It's like it's a classic vanity metric that's always going up and to the right, whatever happens, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what that means, but they must be doing pretty well, and they've definitely landed some great customers. So I think the big test for these folks is how interesting do the LLMs get in terms of what they can do just generically. Like, it doesn't feel like 100x leap is required from O1 preview to O2 preview or whatever it's going to be called from ChatGPT, where it can just generate awesome SDKs. Like that just doesn't feel that far away. So it's an interesting space to watch for sure.
Yeah. And actually, to be honest, that's an interesting question overall. So I mean, if you're watching this and you've got an opinion on, this particular space, or like, would you go down the route of using, a company like Speakeasy or Stainless to generate an SDK, or would you go down an LLM route to do it necessarily if you didn't have the skill yourself or within your team to do it? Like, what would you choose? Like, what would you go for here? Would the trust be there to use the LLMs? I'm assuming that that's one of the other aspects with this as well, is that people aren't quite ready to put that trust in as much as they would say. I guess, there's almost an innate trust here of like, well, you've raised $15 million, you probably do it pretty well. Let's go for you. Let us know if you've got an opinion on that. Drop a comment down below. We'd love to read it. Okay, so next up, something that, again, I'm not ashamed to admit I didn't realize was actually not standardized, and that is the HTTP rate limit header, which is apparently heading towards some kind of standardization at this point, with a proposal that's working its way through the IETF right now. I actually didn't realize that this wasn't standardized. There's just an accepted way to do it at the moment, but that is going to be changing to what you can see on the screen right now, actually, from what was custom headers, which start with an X as standard. X rate limit dash limit, for instance, is going to be changing to rate limit dash policy, and there's going to be a whole set of specifics around it. Josh, this is an area, of course, as being a CEO of a company where HTTP requests are pretty core. This is something that we'll be looking at with interest, I'm sure.
Yeah, so I guess there was some sort of standard around this a little bit before, or a standard, if you call it that, was if we show up the MDN documentation for the 429 too many requests response, it's sort of recommended that you would consider including a retry after header, which we do in Zuplo when you use our rate limit feature. If we rate limit you, by default, we show the retry after header, which tells people when they can come back, which is a little bit of a step towards what they're doing here. But I guess in this design, which Martyn is sharing, you could provide this information all the time and tell people, like, this is what the rate limit policy is, and this is where you're at in terms of your rate limit consumption. Even on a 200 response, I'm guessing this would be applicable, whereas you probably wouldn't do that unless on a retry after, which we do today. Yeah, it's interesting. I assume we'll probably adopt this as an extension to our rate limit policy once it's verified. We like to do everything from a standards basis. What I'm curious about here, and I haven't read the full spec, I admit, is how opinionated they are about whether you should include this or not when rate limits are in play. Because we have a talk we often give about the secret art of rate limiting, how to do it, how we do some of our magic in Zuplo, like async rate limiting to reduce latency. And the advice that I've given in the past is, you actually need to make a concrete decision of, do you want to share your rate limit information? Because, and the decision for me hangs on, are you an API that is likely subject to deliberate attempts of abuse? And so a classic example of that might be something like the Twitter API. Like, people are out there to effectively sort of manipulate that space and squeeze as much resources they can out of each fake user they managed to get going, right? And obviously the Twitter API is quite locked down now, I guess, but it was a good example traditionally. I absolutely would not recommend that engineering team use these headers and share what their rate limits are. Much better that the malicious actor that's hitting their API has to spend time working it out and deducing what sort of load they can give to a given client. However, if you are working with trusted partners, like maybe customers that have a contract with you and are paying you and using your API, then I think sharing this information very proactively with them in the way that this thing describes is a good idea. And I'm curious what people think about that. Do you think it should always be there? But I really feel it opens you up to more targeted, precise abuse if your API is open to sort of a lot of untrusted actors, I would say. Then I personally probably wouldn't recommend it. What do you reckon?
That's actually a very interesting take on it, to be honest. I hadn't thought about it like that, but it's going to be interesting to see what's actually in there, and maybe it does say it. I'll have ChatGPT read it for me later, and suggest whether that is or isn't the case or not. But I guess the other question as well is, like, once one is in place, if you adopt one, are you then going to remove your previously used X custom HTTP headers and how you're going to do that, which leads us quite nicely into the final topic for today, which is do you know how to deprecate an API? Which is something that we have covered recently on the Zuplo blog, zuplo.com/blog. There is a full guide over there as to how this should be done, because there is actually quite a lot to know about how you should take an API and effectively deprecate it or sunset it in an appropriate way, including the use of some specific headers that, again, I wasn't aware actually existed, but and as some people on LinkedIn weren't aware actually existed either. So we did an educate there for sure.
Yeah, that's a great post by Adrian on our team. Actually, we should have him over at the API and Anchor at some point. You still don't know what's in this, actually. I haven't revealed, what I'm drinking here at midday in UK time here in London. But we should have him over. Yeah, I think it's a great post. Actually, reminds me of some funny stories about stuff I saw at Facebook. And we actually have a policy for this as well about API deprecation. Not exactly on the topic that Adrian covered in the blog post. Go read it. We'll include the link. And there was a lot of folks using the B2B APIs at Facebook, and they were. This is a separate story that maybe we can talk about in a second. They were pretty aggressive at changing their API, unusually aggressive at not supporting old versions, getting people to move on to new ones. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the things that I saw happen there was they would set a date for when the API is going to be deprecated, right? Like it's going to go off at this time. But of course, you're monitoring the traffic and people just keep using it. They just don't shut it down. And there's this notion of one technique to use there is to use a brownout. So if you're actually going to have a date, publish the date of when you're going to take the thing down. So, if people have agreed to your terms and conditions, they should be paying attention. They should have migrated their workload. But rather than actually turn them off on the deadline, just turn it off for an hour at 1 a.m. in the morning, like every night after that for a little while. And that means that people's core functionality probably works. Try and do it when it's not their peak business period and it's going to destroy their business. But man, it'll set off a lot of alerts for them, and suddenly they'll take your deprecation threat seriously. People sometimes think, well, that seems really aggressive. Well, not really, because I published the very clear end of life of this thing as being on this day, and then what I really did was give you a bit of a grace period and a warning to identify that you had an issue. Another technique I've heard of is with these APIs is when you release a new one, publicly announce that people should start moving over, what the timeline is, and actually start adding sort of sleep and making the API slower so that there's incentives for people to move over. And that's one of the hard things about deprecating an API. Often people don't know until alerts start firing that there is an API they're dependent on that is coming towards the end of its life. And so a brownout is actually a pretty effective, not quite nuclear warfare mechanism of, telling people that, hey, look, I think you might have missed this particular client here that's calling our API.
Yeah, no, I mean, I like that. I don't know whether that's actually mentioned in the guide, but it might.
I don't think it is. No.
It might be worth putting that in as a little extra. The final, how do you break glass in case of zero communication situation that is likely to come up. I mean, a lot of the time as well, you're going to have email addresses for people that you're trying to communicate with, that have long expired and those people have left, and there just isn't a way to effectively communicate with people about those changes. And people aren't necessarily looking at the headers that are coming back on API responses, or looking at the open API documents to see that deprecation has moved into specific paths, because ultimately things haven't broken, right? Nothing's blown up. So why should you care? But this document that Adrian wrote here is great. It lists out so many different approaches that can be taken, so many different things that you can do, and also now as an extra, a whole bunch of ways to actually do this in a whole range of frameworks, JavaScript frameworks as well. So for actual technical implementations, there are plenty, and he's also outlined a bunch of those as well. So it does make sense to deprecate an API, and it's something that comes for for many of us at some time. And to just not do it or do it ineffectively is just not great API practice, and ultimately it harms you and it harms your customers. So you do want to make sure that you're following best practices when going down that route. And if you need to see what those best practices are, there's a link in the description below.
Love it. Just quickly on the other story about the Facebook as well, though, is that they used to change things very aggressively, but they could do that because you didn't you had to advertise on Facebook. It's not like you had a choice. I'm gonna go and advertise on X instead. Not X. I meant X as a random letter, not as the Twitter platform. You if that's part of your business, you just kind of gotta go and advertise on there. So they have the power where you can do that. On the other hand, you've got people like Stripe, who is a very B2B API also, because the Facebook API is B2B. It's not a B2C thing in most cases.
Yeah.
Stripe doesn't deprecate anything. Like I think their V1 of their API, their charges API, whatever it was called, is still operational today. I mean, most people have probably moved on, but it's still going. They don't deprecate anything because people have a choice, right? If I get annoyed with Stripe, I'm going to go over and pick your payment gateway, Adyen or whatever, So do so with caution. But if you are going to take it down, I think Adrian's guide and thinking about brownout, which is a Zuplo policy, by the way. We actually have a brownout policy that you can use in the code to make that easy. Is a good technique.
Awesome. Well, Josh, I hear the bell ringing in the background. I believe that the staff
Is it last orders?
Are calling time on this episode of API and Anchor. And it's time for us to down our pints and head for the door and make our merry way home to wherever it is we came from. And we'll be back here again in 2 weeks. This is a bi-weekly show. So in 2 weeks' time, we'll be back with a freshly poured pint of new API news and moves. So we look forward to seeing you then. If there's anything that you'd like us to talk about or discuss, drop a link in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for all things API related. And we'll see you next time.